Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America, and all the ships at sea. Africa, that continent that Toto sang so eloquently about in the 1980s, why is it eternally impoverished? Why is it eternally locked in economic, religious, and political struggle? Would it astonish you if I told you that Western European-led nations have actually played the largest part in this? Of course, you're aware of the slave trade that began in the 15th century and went well into the 19th century. But I also need to make you aware that Africans openly traded their own and even enslaved people of European ancestries in the northern part of the continent, though you will never hear those historical facts discussed by lamestream outlets. It just does not serve their propaganda campaign well. Without belaboring that, it must also be noted, though, that the peoples of European ancestry took full advantage of that inhumane trade for multiple centuries, and the longer-lasting effects of broken families and the societal impact of local tribal peoples were deeply ingrained and very difficult to overcome. Think about this, my viewers. Say that hypothetically that some marauding tribe from the next county or state over suddenly came rioting and pillaging through your town or city, taking prisoners, slaves, and concubines. Then, as an extra bit of malice, the next county over warlords decided to keep those kidnapped loved ones as their property, or worse yet, to trade them to foreign powers on ships for goods. That, my friends, would have multi-generational impact on the negative of the societal, cultural, and economic status of your people. There is no getting around that. So, after all those atrocities bludgeoned over the heads of the African peoples, Europe and even the United States decided to colonize, yes, colonize many African nations. You know, that stifling arm of rulership lorded over the United States in its infancy, that which the Revolutionary War was so valiantly waged against, the shedding of the British crown. Yet the United States, along with its European allies, horrifically stole, plundered, and invaded the African nations in the most blatant money grabs seen in the entire history of the world. Yes, they did yet more horrific things to the African peoples. You know, those bastions of democratic ideology, where every human is created equal and free markets are allowed to reign. That is, unless we are discussing third world nations with easily bribed government officials and so many natural resources to extort. Let this puppet say right here that greed is by no means unique or specific to any certain nationality or skin color. But it does need to be stated that the Western nations have certainly showed no shame in their mistreatment of the African continent, its peoples, and nations over the centuries. Now, my loyal viewers, it must be said that the African continent was, and still is, rich in natural resources. The medieval European shipping magnates knew this, and the modern 12 Eyes governments and their corporate cronies know this. You need more gold, diamond, and emeralds to fill the coffers of your European aristocracy? Take your ships and their bludgeoning goons to Africa. You need oil to fuel the motor vehicles in your ever more petroleum-thirsty first world nation? Send your corporate goons to bribe the local officials, then proceed to abuse and kill local peasants, along with ruining their ecology, all without any remorse or backlash from the large lamestream media outlets that are in your back pockets. This, my friends, is the core issue as to why the West continues to abuse and crush Africa to this very day. Africa, quite simply, led by corrupt government thieves who are more than willing to sell out their people and lands for their own enrichment. Now, as you might say, these people need to rise up against their wicked headmasters. Kids, these people are largely poor, impoverished, malnourished, physically and mentally weakened, and otherwise handicapped in their abilities to overcome corruption, and some of that even goes back to the era of the slave trade that I talked about a bit earlier. Starting in the early 1970s, Shell Oil Corp began to bribe Nigerian President Goodluck Jonathan's administration for the rights to the OPL 245 offshore oil field. As soon as the bribes were accepted, Shell Oil began to literally rape the people of Nigeria like none other. People lost their homes, lands were irreparably polluted, oil spills killed every type of wildlife, water wells were sickeningly ruined, and no one said a word, especially the U.S. or other Western governments. We all have heard about global warming and how electric automobiles are the answer, but do many of those watching this video know about where the cobalt is mined that makes up the vast majority of those batteries? Africa, and more specifically the Congo, is rich in that natural resource. Have the Western nations abused the African people in order to get their greedy mitts on that element? Do zebras have stripes? Kids as young as 8 years old toil 12 sweaty hours per day in the underground cobalt mines, often without food or water. Most make less than $600 per month and cannot even sustain their families on the surf wages. Often they are not even given mining tools and are required to pluck the cobalt from the surrounding rock and soil with just their calloused fingers and hands. Compounding the problem is that companies will often tout their adherence to industry human rights standards that target a limited number of issues. For instance, in its most recent impact report, Tesla stated that it only works with cobalt suppliers in the Congo that conform with the Responsible Minerals Initiative Responsible Minerals Assurance Process, or RMAP, whose standards focus on forced labor and the worst forms of child labor. While RMAP standards are important, they target two very narrow issues around labor rights. In effect, the bar is set so low on respect for workers' rights it is largely meaningless. It needs to be noted that Tesla dismantled its public relations department in 2019 and no longer responds to questions from reporters. All of this occurs daily, loyal viewers, while lamestream media looks the other way and 12 Eyes government leaders call for complete bans on petroleum-fueled motor vehicles. Next up, everyone under the sound of my voice needs to know about an African nation called Equatorial Guinea. This goes beyond the pale as to the African atrocities backed exclusively by the United States of America. You know, that bastion of democracy and human rights. In 1967, the citizens of this Spanish colony started demanding independence. In late 1968, Equatorial Guinea was granted its independence by its Spanish colonizers. The first president of this newly liberated nation was Francisco Macias Nguema, also known as Macias Nguema Biogo Masi, and was criminally insane. After his election in 1971, he assumed wide-ranging powers and pushed through a constitution that named him president for life in July of 1972. He assumed absolute personal powers in 1973, and the island of Fernando Po was renamed Macias Nguema Biogo Island in his honor. He controlled the radio and press, and all foreign travel was stopped. From 1975 to 1977, there were many false arrests and summary executions, which brought protests from world leaders and human rights organization Amnesty International. During this period, there was a mass exodus by citizens of Equatorial Guinea who could no longer endure the Third Reich murder tactics. This murderous dictator was mercifully overthrown in 1979 by his nephew, Lieutenant Colonel Teodoro Obiang Nguema Mbasogo, and executed. Obiang led a supreme military council to which he added some civilians in 1981. A less authoritarian constitution was instituted in 1982, followed by the election of 41 unopposed candidates to the legislature in 1983. Although another new constitution in 1991 provided for a multi-party state, leading to the first multi-party elections held in 1993, there was no indication that Obiang would willingly give up power, and his regime was the subject of much international criticism for its oppressive nature. As it turned out, he was just as evil, filthy, and corrupt as the uncle he overthrew earlier. During the ruthless regimes of these two, it needs to be noted that massive petroleum reserves were discovered directly off the west coast of Equatorial Guinea. Needless to say, none of the brutalized citizenry benefited even the slightest bit from this discovery. No, instead, the usual large petro corporations swept in, paid massive bribes directly to both Macias Nguema and Teodoro Mbasogo, and they of course were greatly enriched themselves and their direct families, all while locals continued to be locked up in gulags and executed for having committed no crimes whatsoever. Through all of this Pol Pot killing fields terrorism that has ensued for the past 50-plus horrendous years, it needs to be noted that the United States government has stood staunchly beside the two terrorist dictators and never once denounced the manslaughters they were committing. Yep, you know, the land of the free and the home of the brave. Yep, firmly standing behind one of the most brutal regimes for the past 50-plus years now. That, my friends, is inexcusable and would be widely denounced were it not in Africa. You know, that continent that has been used and abused by Western governments since nearly the dawn of time. It seems for all intents and purposes that the Western nations were somehow afraid that the African nations could somehow overtake and or threaten them and their global hegemony if allowed full autonomy and use of their plentiful natural resources. So since we most certainly could not have that going on, the next step was to collude to keep the African continent artificially repressed, bribed, corrupted, and otherwise held down. Now, before you think I am giving the corrupt African rulers a free pass on this one, I most certainly am not. It just needs to be stated that the people of corrupt African nations would eventually rise up and overcome were it not for outside Western nations continuing to apply their corrupt colonizing practices. Good night, and sleep well.